ChatGPT can't threaten the existence of philosophy or the humanities. That's the argument I'm going to make here today, and I'm going to be focusing specifically on the case of philosophy. And of course, what I have to say here is not just about ChatGPT, but about large language models in general, as we know them today. So I want to start with an analogy, right? So the concern is, of course, that these machines and these new tools will somehow replace us. And so let's imagine something else being replaced. Let's imagine cows being replaced, okay? Let's imagine that someone develops synthetic milk, right? And also, let's say, synthetic meat. And that they're much cheaper to produce, and they're just as tasty or even tastier than what cows offer. And also that maybe they even have properties that cow milk doesn't have. Like it can be consumed by people who are lactose intolerant and still get all the nutritional benefits and so on. Let's imagine this. So under these conditions, what do we think would happen to cows, right? Would they now cease to exist because they're no longer needed to produce milk and meat? Or rather, cows will continue to be cows, and they'll continue to breed and reproduce and produce each other. It's part of what it is, a cow, is to flourish in reproducing, right? And we human beings might not have the incentive anymore to factory farm, right? And to use these cruel and cruel and inhuman or all too human ways of treating them in order to get the most meat and the most milk out of them. But there's no reason why cows would cease to be. They'd continue to reproduce each other. And I think that the case of philosophers is the same thing. That maybe our place as producers of text, so maybe our role in writing books and articles and papers, and maybe even producing videos, right? Because more and more AI can produce good videos, and maybe we'll have, instead of ourselves, we'll be asked to have, who knows, the faces of celebrities and actors to deliver our philosophical content. But in any case, our function as producers may be threatened by AI. But ultimately, philosophy is a kind of way of life that one philosopher transmits to the next. And therefore, there is no threat here to philosophy from something that can take over our productive tasks, right? Because, you might say, well, if we no longer need cows, we might just let them go extinct. Who knows what might happen? And that would be truly frightful, considering how many cows exist in the world. But in the case of philosophers, in this hypothetical scenario, maybe, we no longer need the cows to produce the synthetic milk and meat. And I guess also leather and other things that we get from cows. But in the case of large language models, they still will need to be trained on the best and newest philosophical insights around. It still needs to listen in, at least on the communications of philosophers to each other. There still needs to be some kind of an active philosophical community for it to mimic and follow and grow. And maybe this philosophical community doesn't need to communicate anymore in this way of producing papers for a select group, but which are in principle directed to an unknown reader, and writing books that can fall in anyone's hand. Maybe the main way that people will get philosophical content is through AI delivering it on the spot, tailored to their specific demands and questions. That's very possible, but there still has to be a philosophical community that it's listening in on for it to train itself. So in that sense, it still needs for there to be a reproducing philosophical community. And it can replace philosophers just as little as books can, right? So sometimes a philosophical tradition, a certain way of thinking and arguing, and a certain set of concerns about the world and about our knowledge of the world goes into disuse. But its texts remain. And it's later picked up again because the texts are still there. And then what happens is that someone picks up these texts and they read them again. And because, the texts were preserved simply because paper lasts, or because they were preserved for, who knows, a historical interest or something like that. And then someone reads these texts, but since these classical texts were well written, they learn again how to practice this form of philosophy. Of course, everything when it is reborn changes, so it's not exactly the same thing that happened before. But now this person has again become a philosopher in this tradition, and now they will start teaching other people to do that. So, and that's the most that a book can do, and it's the most that anything that just produces text can do. All it can do really is, if it manages to replace a philosopher, then it will manage to form another philosopher, and then bam, you have again a reproducing philosophical community, right? And in that way, I think the university is in crisis, and there's a big question about how can the kind of learning at scale that happened at large universities still exist, and how can this identity of the researcher as this person who produces and puts out articles and results and books, how can that continue? These are indeed things that are in crisis, and I'm sure that the university as we know it will probably change into something totally different. But philosophy as such, it won't. As Plato puts it in his Phaedrus, right? Philosophy actually, its texts aren't written texts. It's a living speech that one philosopher writes in the soul of another philosopher. It's always this person-to-person communication. And I'm also reminded here of the distinction between labor, work, and action that Hannah Arendt drew in her Human Condition. So on the one hand, there's labor, which is everything that we do to attend to the biological necessities of life and in order to consume whatever we produce. So like making food or things to drink, that's stuff that we make and we consume, or also, cleaning away waste that we produce, that every day we have to clean again and again, because we're always producing, we're always producing a clean environment when we clean, and then we're always undoing it because we're constantly producing waste. And so that's labor. And then there's work, where we make things that last, right? Buildings, books, even shoes. These are things that last for more than their just immediate use. Sometimes they last many generations. And so that's already something different from labor. And finally, there's action, where we interact with each other, when we talk with each other, and in our dialogues with each other, we reveal who we are and the unique people that each of us was born to be. And philosophy, when we think about it in this Platonic context of Socrates addressing his fellow citizens, is very much in the domain of action, and this idea of planting in each other seeds that come from our souls and that grow in us. Arendt has things to say about the distinction between action, contemplation, and some criticisms of the philosophical tradition. But even then, whether we want to separate off philosophical contemplation from action, or we want to include it because it has this intersubjective element, what defines philosophy isn't work, right? It's certainly not labor, where you don't just produce something to get to be consumed at the end of the month. And if this recently there was a post about throwaway philosophy that reflects that lots of philosophy nowadays is produced like this, like like labor. It's also not work, right? Even though we really admire philosophers that wrote these great works that lasted for many generations and that are read till today, basically what we do as philosophers isn't that, right? It's forming each other, it's investigating what is true and what unites the world with each other, and thereby knowing ourselves and revealing ourselves to each other. So that's philosophical action, and that has no reason to be threatened by LLMs. If anything, these large language models will free us from the burden of having to produce and having to constantly write and be cogs in a great publication system. Rather, it will let us, outsource this part of production, and which includes also, making videos like this, and ultimately let us focus on person-to-person teaching and joint investigation of peers. So of course there's a lot that's scary and there's a lot that's going to change, but ultimately what is essential about philosophy, and I think about the humanities more generally, that will continue.